In December 1975, a 24-year-old Kodak engineer captured the world's first digital photograph, a grainy black and white image that took 23 seconds just to appear. He brought it to his bosses. Their response? Cute, but don't tell anyone. That sentence sealed the fate of a company earning $14 billion a year on 70% margins. One choice crippled an empire, erased over 100,000 jobs, and turned the most trusted name in photography into a bankruptcy filing. But to understand why Kodak buried its own future, you first need to understand what it was protecting. In 1880, George Eastman began manufacturing dry plates in a modest Rochester loft. By 1888, he secured a patent for a simple box camera and trademarked a meaningless 5-letter word that would soon redefine human memory: Kodak. With it came a simple promise: you press the button, we do the rest. It was the birth of an empire built not on hardware, but on nostalgia. Before this, photography was a cumbersome, expensive craft. But in 1900, the introduction of the $1 Brownie camera democratized the medium, transforming snapshot photography into a mass-market habit. Think about how profound that shift was. Suddenly, a camera wasn't a complex laboratory instrument, it was a toy, a household staple. Kodak didn't just sell silver halide and yellow boxes. They sold the preservation of childhood, holidays, and family milestones. They branded the Kodak moment, a cultural monopoly on personal history itself. How do you challenge a company that literally archives your life? By the mid-1990s, this strategy had made Kodak virtually untouchable. The company controlled 90% of the photographic film market and 85% of consumer camera sales in the United States. This empire employed over 140,000 people globally, anchored by a $30 billion market valuation. For over a century, Kodak had woven itself so deeply into the fabric of daily life that its dominance felt like an immutable law of nature, an empire too woven into the human experience to ever fade. The foundation of this multi-billion-dollar empire rested on a classic razor and blades business model. Kodak sold cameras cheaply, treating the physical hardware as a gateway to the real prize. The true wealth lay in the recurring purchase of consumables: silver, halide film, chemical reagents, and photographic paper. By the mid-1990s, this film business generated $14.1 billion in annual revenue, carrying profit margins of roughly 70% on every single roll. When you are printing money at 70% margins, how do you justify changing the machine? The answer is, you don't. Kodak's internal logic rewarded protecting the cash cow, not slaughtering it. Executives were paid bonuses based on film revenue targets, creating an incentive structure that actively punished anyone who wanted to look elsewhere. This financial gravity pulled the company's research culture inward. Instead of funding radical alternatives, the vast majority of Kodak's 7,000 research and development employees spent their days perfecting legacy chemistry. The giant was incredibly strong, but it had built a golden cage of its own design, leaving it completely unable to bend when the wind shifted. In 1973, a 24-year-old electrical engineer named Steve Sasson joined Kodak's research division straight from the Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. He was handed a minor, open-ended task: find a practical use for a new electronic sensor called a charge-coupled device. For 2 years, Sasson worked in a corner of the Rochester laboratory, wiring together a lens, an analog-to-digital converter, and a magnetic cassette recorder. On December 12, 1975, he assembled his creation. It was a blue, toaster-sized machine weighing 8 pounds. Sasson pointed the lens at a lab technician named Joy Marshall, pressed the button, and waited 23 seconds for the machine to record a 0.01 megapixel black and white image. It took another 23 seconds to display her face on a nearby television monitor. Think about that timing. In the winter of 1975, the future of digital imaging was sitting on a lab bench in Rochester. It didn't belong to a foreign upstart or a Silicon Valley rival. It belonged to Kodak. This wasn't some abstract theory. It was a physical machine. It was clunky, heavy, and slow. But it worked. If you invent the future, how do you fail to own it? The company filed for a patent on May 20, 1977, securing intellectual property rights for the electronic still camera. Published in late 1978, patent number 4,131,919 gave the film pioneer legal ownership over the exact technology that would eventually dismantle its entire business. When Steve Sasson demonstrated his prototype to the executive suite in Rochester, the response was immediate. Leadership called the technology cute, but don't tell anyone. This warning was a deliberate corporate policy. In 1979, a senior Kodak engineer named Larry Mattison wrote an internal memo predicting that digital imaging would eventually dismantle the film business. But the corporate structure was designed to ignore the alarm. How do you convince executives to kill their own golden goose? You can't, especially when their paychecks depend on it. In February 1990, Kodak announced that its senior team would forego $1.1 million in performance bonuses simply because they missed their traditional film revenue targets. When your entire livelihood is tied to selling yellow boxes of film, why would you ever greenlight a technology designed to make those boxes obsolete? To protect the cash cow, Kodak treated digital imaging as a defensive shield rather than an offensive weapon. Instead of manufacturing a first-party line of consumer digital cameras, leadership focused on licensing their groundbreaking sensor patents to external rivals like Nikon. The goal was short-term cash flow with zero risk of cannibalizing film sales. It was a devastating calculation. Willie Shih, who later ran the digital and applied imaging division, noted that the fear of cannibalizing film revenue was baked into every single product review. They fully understood the digital transition, but they were frozen by it. They chose the safety of licensing fees over the risk of market leadership. By relegating digital development to a side path, Kodak allowed its rivals to build the consumer ecosystem. The warning signs were clear and the technology was theirs. But Kodak chose protection over productization. While Kodak debated inside its Rochester boardroom, the rest of the industry moved into the open. In 1996, Canon launched the PowerShot series, targeting everyday consumers. A year later, Sony introduced the Mavica, which allowed users to save photos directly onto standard floppy disks. By 1998, Fujifilm entered the race with the FinePix line. A fluid digital ecosystem was forming in real time, directly in front of Kodak's eyes. Look at what the competition was doing. They focused on building entire workflows rather than simply selling hardware. Sony made it easy. You took a picture, put the disc in your computer and emailed it. That was the magic loop. Meanwhile, what was Kodak doing? They were still trying to figure out how to sell physical prints from a digital file. They completely missed the value of instant digital connectivity. Kodak did have digital products, but they were fundamentally mismatched with the consumer market. The DCS-100, launched in 1991, was a high-priced, bulky DSLR intended strictly for professional photojournalists. When Kodak finally tried to reach ordinary families, its offerings were late and fragmented. The EasyShare camera line did not arrive until 2001. By then, competitors already dominated the compact digital camera segment. It was a clear case of too little, too late. EasyShare was a decent product, but it remained anchored to the past. Kodak tried to solve the digital shift with physical infrastructure, like the picture kiosk in 1999 and various digital print services. They wanted you to take a digital photo, walk to a retail store, and print it on Kodak paper. How do you survive when your entire strategy is designed to force a digital user back into a legacy business model? On January 19, 2012, the financial reality caught up with the legacy. Eastman Kodak filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection, buckling under $6.75 billion of debt. The company's crowning achievements, thousands of pioneering digital imaging patents, were no longer tools for future innovation. Instead, they became liquidation, assets, to satisfy creditors. A patent portfolio once valued by independent intellectual property firms at over $2 billion was sold off in a court-supervised auction for just $525 million. The buyers were the very technology giants that had built the modern digital world: Apple, Google, and Samsung. Look at who walked away with those assets. It wasn't other camera companies. It was the mobile phone giants. The technologies Kodak invented to protect its film empire were acquired for pennies on the dollar to power the exact devices that made physical film completely obsolete. It is the ultimate strategic irony. Kodak spent decades hoarding patents, only to watch its rivals use those same patents to construct the digital world that buried them. Beyond the corporate boardrooms, the human cost of the collapse settled heavily over Rochester, New York. For over a century, Kodak had been more than an employer. It was a social and economic anchor. At its peak in the early 1980s, the company's Rochester workforce numbered 145,000. By the time of the bankruptcy filing, that local presence had plummeted to just 14,000. Entire neighborhoods built around the promise of stable, lifetime manufacturing careers faced sudden stagnation. Professional photographers, too, mourned the steady disappearance of the high-quality color negative films they had trusted to render their artistic vision. As Kodak shuttered production lines and halted chemical processing services, a tangible creative medium vanished from the market. The final chapters of the Kodak story were written in more than lost market capitalization. They were written in the deindustrialization of a proud city and the irreversible erasure of an artistic era. Pride goes before destruction, a haughty spirit before a fall. This ancient warning remains the ultimate epitaph for the fallen titan of Rochester. The tragedy of Kodak was never a failure of engineering, nor was it a simple lack of foresight. It was the heavy, suffocating weight of corporate infallibility, the blind belief that some empires are simply too grand to ever fade. How do you convince an empire that it is mortal? When you have dominated a global industry for over a century, critical warnings just look like minor background noise. Kodak did not collapse because they could not see the digital horizon. They collapsed because they believed they owned the horizon itself, and that the world would always wait for their permission to change. The story of Kodak is not a failure of invention, it is a failure of transition. When a business model achieves supreme dominance, the primary threat to its survival is no longer its competitors, but its own legacy of success. Adapting requires more than discovering new technology. It requires the courage to dismantle the very engine that funds your current existence. Ask yourself, if your team invented a technology that could wipe out your primary source of revenue, how would your board react? Would they celebrate or would they bury it? The reality is that most corporate structures are designed to defend the status quo. If your executive incentives only reward short-term sales of your legacy products, you are paying your leaders to ignore the future. You cannot build a bridge to tomorrow when every bonus check is tied to preserving yesterday. A disruptive product cannot exist in a vacuum. It requires an entire network of utility, connectivity, and experience. Kodak possessed the hardware, the processing power, and the intellectual property. Yet, they viewed digital imaging as a defensive shield to protect physical paper prints, rather than an open door to instant sharing. They prioritized their manufacturing infrastructure over the evolving needs of their customers. We often treat cannibalization as a threat, a danger to be avoided at all costs. But in a shifting market, cannibalization is simply the price of survival. If you do not eat your own business, someone else will gladly do it for you. Look at your own pipeline right now. What breakthrough is sitting on a lab bench or hidden in an internal memo because it threatens this quarter's margins? If a 130-year-old empire with 90% market share could hide its future in a closet, what are you burying in yours? The end of an empire is rarely sudden. It is a slow accumulation of small, defensive compromises made in the name of safety. But the greatest risk of all is refusing to change when the world demands it. The future belongs not to those who inherit the horizon, but to those who are willing to recreate it. Today, Kodak's ghost haunts every modern boardroom facing the disruptive rise of artificial intelligence. Because the hardest thing to disrupt isn't the market, it's your own success. If you won't cannibalize your business, someone else will. What is the next empire destined to fall? Share your thoughts below and subscribe for more.